In the heart of Russia, there is a company that operates by a different set of rules. A company that is worth tens of billions of dollars. A company that controls 12% of the world's entire supply of natural gas and 10% of Russia's entire GDP. This company is controlled by the Russian state, but don't be fooled. There are many high-profile private owners entitled to a share of its profits, operating like a small kingdom to fill the purses of the Russian elite and hide their wealth from the public eye. It's long been rumored that this company is the personal profit mill of Vladimir Putin. But that's just where the story starts, because as of February 2023, this company now wields something that goes far beyond mere ill-gotten gains: a new private army. A private army developed under the pretense of protecting Russian gas resources. A private army that was then instead secretly deployed to Ukraine alongside the Wagner Group, threatening Wagner's position of prominence and nearly leading to a Russian civil war in the process. Today, we're talking about Gazprom, the Russian oil and gas giant that is now dipping its toes directly into the highly profitable business of international warfare, boosting Putin's net worth, displacing the Wagner Group, and nearly leading to a Russian civil war in the process. This story hasn't yet been widely told in this way. In the chaos of war headlines, few have put together all of the pieces. But it's a story that can be easily verified by following the sources, and a story that explains everything you need to know about the modern state of Russia and the war in Ukraine. From the invasion of Crimea in 2014, to the invasion of the Donbass that took the world by storm in 2022, to the Wagner Group coup in 2023. It can all be explained by Gazprom, Russia's largest gas company turned mercenary hit group, and Vladimir Putin's favorite cash cow. Early in the morning, on February 4th, 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin found himself in a panic. This isn't something you normally would expect to hear from the leader of the Wagner Group. As the man in charge of Russia's largest private military company, you might even assume that Prigozhin was incapable of feeling fear. We are talking about someone who spent most of the past year recruiting prisoners he fully planned to send to their deaths, fighting in some of the bloodiest battles of the 21st century. A ruthless military leader who has also proven he is willing to kill his own soldiers at a moment's notice if he perceives them to be disloyal. Prigozhin checks all of the boxes for a cool, collected psychopath who always knows exactly what he is doing and has no compunctions about doing it. This is the image he has painted of himself since September 2022, when he went public about the fact that he was, as suspected, the leader of the Wagner Group. And yet, in early February of the next year, Prigozhin found himself revealing a rare moment of exposure and fear. That day, the Russian government made an announcement that went unnoticed by much of Western media, but of which the significance was not lost on the Wagner Group leader. There would be a new private security company forming in Russia. On the surface, this didn't seem that significant. Most people read the headlines and moved on shortly after, not putting much thought into the ramifications. Many private military organizations had formed following the invasion of Ukraine in order to cash in on government funds being thrown at the conflict. Most were small-time operations, which posed the Wagner Group no threat. But this one was different. This one stopped Prigozhin in his tracks, as he realized that his entire career as a mercenary leader was about to be put in jeopardy. Because this private military organization was being created by someone much more ominous than a wannabe Russian millionaire. This one was being created by Gazprom, the largest company in Russia, which controlled 10% of the entire Russian economy, and whose deep ties to Vladimir Putin have been no secret since the very start of his presidency. Prigozhin was no fool. As a Russian oligarch who was himself deeply embedded in his country's corruption, he knew exactly what this meant. But many onlookers might not. So to help make it clearer, there's just a few things you should know about Gazprom. We've already mentioned that Gazprom is a state-controlled company that has private shareholders entitled to its profits. But what does this actually mean? If you think of any publicly traded company, in any country in the world, the decisions made by that company are directed by the majority shareholders. The more shares you own in a company, the more votes you have when it comes to deciding who gets to sit on the company's board of directors. If you own the majority of the company, even only a very slim majority, you get to choose the majority of the board and basically direct the company's entire future and every decision the company makes. But what many people don't realize is that there can be many other anonymous owners of this same company who still get a share of the profits even if they don't directly make the decisions. If one person or entity owns 50% of a company, the other 50% of the company can be owned by any number of people. If they own 1% of the company, they're entitled to 1% of the profits. If they own 10%, they're entitled to 10%. You get the picture. In Gazprom, the Russian government owns approximately 50.5% of the company, the bare minimum that they must own to direct every decision about the company's future and call it a state enterprise. When Gazprom calls itself a state enterprise, many people are under the illusion that all of their profits go directly back to the Russian government. This gives many Russian citizens a feeling of comfort, knowing that the profits from their largest producing industry are benefiting the people rather than a few greedy capitalists. But actually, that's not true. It's actually the opposite. Since the state government only owns 50.5% of the company, only 50.5% of the profits make their way back to the state. The other 49.5% of the profits are up for grabs by the same kind of greedy capitalists that Russian propaganda has fooled the Russian people into believing they are escaping by calling it a state company. This creates a mechanism that allows the Russian government to very easily move money out of the hands of the Russian federal budget and into the hands of individual people the government wants to bribe, without ever writing those people an actual physical check that would leave a paper trail. The question is, who is getting the other 49.5% of the profits? Something which is equivalent to nearly 5% of Russia's entire GDP. If you understand the answer to this question, you understand everything you need to know about Russian politics. When Vladimir Putin came into power, one of his first areas of focus was the ownership and leadership of Gazprom, one of the few areas where he took personal responsibility for success. Almost immediately after becoming president, he appointed a new company manager, Alexei Miller, a longtime friend with few qualifications to speak of, who quickly purged the company's leadership and replaced them with Putin loyalists. This gave Putin personal control of nearly every decision the company made, every dollar they made in profit, and every investment they asked for from the Russian government in pursuit of those dollars. Putin then became intensely interested in growing the profits of Gazprom by growing its foreign market share, using the company as a weapon to grow the power of the Russian state, while also using the power of the Russian state to grow the profits of the company, doing things like invading countries with large energy reserves, countries like Syria and Ukraine, to grow Gazprom's international market share. But Putin probably wasn't just doing this out of a love for king and country. On many occasions, investigative journalists have looked into all of these details surrounding Gazprom, and many more. Their discoveries have included a vast, complex network of shell companies holding Gazprom shares, with a paper trail that very often leads back to Putin and his oligarchs. One journalist estimated that he probably personally owns 4.5% of the entire company, although the actual number could be much higher. If true, this would mean that every investment the Russian government makes in Gazprom is an investment in Putin's own personal pocketbook, allowing him to take nearly 5% right off the top, whether this revenue comes from oil and gas, or whether it comes from bullets, blood, and artillery shells. And now you're starting to understand why Gazprom just might have wanted to dip its toes into the juicy profits of mercenary warfare, taking its share of the market away from the Wagner Group, which was quickly spiraling out of control for Putin. Even without a profit motive, the growing political influence of the Wagner Group would have been enough to push Putin into action. So let's go back to the mind of Yevgeny Prigozhin on that fateful February morning in 2023. Due to international boycotts of Russian energy, Gazprom's gas profits had been teetering on the edge for the past year. What had once been one of the most monolithic companies on the planet was now quickly approaching insolvency and bankruptcy. And it was no secret that the company was now having to seek out other avenues for profitability. The problem was, due to Western sanctions, there were none. No matter where Gazprom looked to make money, there were simply no options for them to earn the revenues they needed as long as Putin's war was ongoing. This left them with just one choice. They could either go bankrupt from the war, or they could attach their profitability directly to the war effort, so that Putin could still spin the campaign as a win. What Prigozhin could have predicted came true. Gazprom, a company that many have called Putin's own private company, masquerading as a state enterprise, was entering the mercenary business. The message was clear. Putin had his eyes on a new sector of the economy, a sector he wanted all for himself. And so his competitors had better get in line or get out of town. At the time, Wagner was in a highly weakened, somewhat embarrassing state. For most of the past decade, they had developed a reputation as a cream-of-the-crop military force, taking strategic military objectives all over the world to secure natural resources and political victories for Russia's oligarchs. But in recent months, the Wagner Group had been reduced to stormtroopers, bum-rushing an unstrategic target in a World War I-style conventional conflict. What was once a well-funded special operations unit was now quickly becoming a ragtag army of untrained prisoners, which was quickly losing the support of the Russian government, something which showed up clearly in the persistent issues Wagner began to experience with poorly functioning weapons and a serious lack of ammunition. Almost as if by design, Gazprom's new private military group was poised to take advantage of this. They came right out of the gate offering the highest wages in town, willing to pay top dollar to secure top talent, along with promises to provide top-of-the-line military gear that was far superior to what was being given to others. In fact, Gazprom's men were paid so well that Prigozhin himself commented that if all Russian soldiers were paid like they were, the entire Russian state would soon fall apart. But like a startup paying huge salaries to attract their first engineers, Gazprom's goal wasn't to pay every soldier in Russia top-of-the-line wages. Instead, it was simply trying to establish itself as the best show in town as quickly as possible. And it was working. Gazprom's offers began to quickly siphon off the best of Russia's mercenaries. Mercenaries the Wagner Group was already having enough trouble recruiting as it was. It would only take a few years, or even a few months, for the Wagner Group to seem like yesterday's trash, the place where prisoners went when they had no other options, while all the real professional soldiers ran off to join Gazprom. It didn't take Prigozhin long to react to the news. 5 days after Gazprom's mercenary force was announced, Prigozhin made an announcement of his own. The Wagner Group would no longer be recruiting from prisons. Mysteriously, he didn't give any specific reason for the end of the prison recruitment program. Something made all the more strange by the fact that Wagner definitely still needed these fresh prison recruits if they wanted to fulfill their short-term mission and get the credit for taking Bakhmut. But Prigozhin had his eyes set on a much bigger prize. The political games had begun, and it would take less than 5 months for the chess match to escalate into what nearly became an all-out Russian civil war. And it was actually Gazprom who fired the first shots. We don't know exactly when they arrived in Ukraine. What we do know is that they quickly abandoned the official reason for their existence, to defend Russian gas resources, and were instead deployed right alongside Wagner within just a few months of their formation. While Wagner took the risky job of charging the Ukrainian front line in zombie wave-style attacks, Gazprom units would receive the much more secure and comfortable job of watching Wagner's flanks, a task they took away from the Wagner Group, and another reason for professional soldiers to join Gazprom over Wagner. When Wagner needed them most, Gazprom's mercenary units secretly left their positions, leaving Wagner soldiers exposed and vulnerable to any Ukrainian troops who uncovered the treachery and realized that Wagner had no security watching their back. And while Gazprom units did this, units run by the Russian Ministry of Defense also did the same, indicating that the betrayal was taking place at the very highest level. Prigozhin knew exactly what was going on. He could not come right out and say that the Russian state had turned its back on Wagner to secure the profits for Putin, because that would almost certainly cause his soldiers to flee, while also providing an opportunity for Ukrainian forces to exploit this weakness and division on the Russian side. But he did begin to complain quite vocally about the fact that his flanks were constantly being abandoned, citing poor training and equipment rather than treachery. The problem is, Gazprom's units were well trained, and they had great equipment. This was part of the philosophy behind their entire formation. They didn't seem to be abandoning their positions because they were afraid. They seemed to be abandoning their positions because it made Wagner weaker. Putin's new private army seemed to be being used to whittle down the power of Prigozhin's private army, setting the stage to replace Wagner and move more of the mercenary profits into Putin's hands through Gazprom to make up for Russia's tanking gas revenues. Eventually, Prigozhin finally had enough. He turned his back on Russia, demanded the removal of Russia's military leaders from power, and engaged them in an armed conflict before turning his army to march on Moscow directly towards Putin. Then, inexplicably, it all came to an end. I hope you enjoyed this analysis. This episode was made possible by my Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members, who continue to support my work and make it possible for me to fund the editing and animation behind these videos. If that sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, I'm deeply appreciative. You can learn more by clicking the membership tab on my main channel page, or by following the link to Patreon in the description. Thanks for helping to make this channel possible. And of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so that this video can reach even more people.